It's been a while since we started our introduction into Greek civilization, and if you remember, we began by walking on the campus of Berkeley, and it was there that we discovered that the campus was designed in this Greek fashion, very classical fashion. And at the heart of the campus, we discovered a building called the Greek Theater. And we went on to tell about how the theater for the Greeks was important for their democracy. It was a place to play out ideas, to get people to think, and ultimately make decisions that were pertinent to their democracy. Today we're going to dive into the actual architecture of the theater and see how much that affects modern day theater and how it affected Greek visual arts, making more dramatic images, whether it be in sculpture, paintings, or mosaics. Walk into any modern theater with ticket in hand, and you might find yourself excited for the curtains to be drawn back and for the show to begin. But what you may not realize is the show began the moment you walked into the theater, because the Greeks spent years designing the experience of just arriving into the theater and finding your seats.
Now, I got to this show particularly early, so I didn't have to battle and elbow my way in. But I find myself in the center of the theater, the good vantage point, and I'm ready for the show to begin.
Now, of course, architects don't design theaters just for one person, they design them for hundreds of people. And you have to think that just getting people in and out of a theater is pretty demanding. Now, I showed up early to this particular show, but if I had arrived just when everyone else was arriving, it would have been more difficult. And so our Greek architects had this in mind, and there's two particular things that they designed that we take for granted. One of which are the aisles. This breaks up all of these seats in a way that not everyone is jostling for the same seat in the same area. You don't have to climb over one of another. The other is the gangway, which divides it horizontally so that those on the top tiers don't have to climb on all those people seated on the bottom tiers.
Now, no matter where you sit in a theater, it's been designed so that you can see relatively well and you can hear relatively well. Whether you find yourself in the front row, or somewhere way in the back. It's those simple things that we take for granted that the Greeks thought of and designed into every theater they created.
So, having designed the aisles and gangways to allow people to find their seats pretty easily so the show begins, the architects also had to think of yet another important thing, which is to give everyone a pretty clear view of the actors on the stage. And they actually found something in Mother Nature that would allow them to find the perfect setting for a theater, and that, of course, is a hill. They built these Greek theaters on the side of a hill, giving them this natural slope that would allow each of those visitors or those patrons of the theater to see the actors from any particular seat. Now, this sloped semicircle funnel shape was advantageous not just to allow the spectators to see the actual actors on the stage, but also to hear them, much like a pebble being thrown into a still pond and the ripple effects flow out from the center. The architects of a Greek theater thought the sound would travel the same way, from the actors' voices all the way up to the viewers' ears. Much like modern movies, Greeks were drawn to the theater for the suspense and for the drama. And because Greece was populated with many artists, we can assume those artists also were at the theater. And they were taking in this drama. And much like when they were watching the Greek athletes during the Olympics, they must have been watching these Greek actors and imagining what they could produce in visual arts. whether it be in painting or mosaics or sculpture. You've got to take into account that there was also sound effects and there was also other props on the stage, and so all this visual play that artists are naturally drawn to. The theater would have been just a great place for them to absorb new possibilities and be inspired by Greek drama. One of the props and animals that reoccurs in Greek dramas is the serpent, the snake. And no sculpture really captures this idea of an artist, a visual artist, being inspired by Greek drama than this one here. This one is Laocoon and his sons. And you can see this almost looks like three actors that are just frozen in time, right? So much more dramatic than anything we've seen. If we remember back to the Egyptian works and those early Greek works, this is something new and much more vibrant and dramatic. Now you can see how the sculpture is capturing this moment where this three individuals are being devoured by this large snake. And to make a long story short, they're being punished because they were trying to tell the Trojans that the Trojan horse was indeed not a gift, but something that they should be wary of. And the gods and goddesses didn't like that, and thus sent this serpent to devour them. And so it's as if we're watching a movie here and it's been paused. And you've got to remember, this is made in marble. And so to get marble to do this, to kind of float in air, look at that snake and its body intertwining around those figures. And then look at their faces. This is a father and two sons. And you've got to imagine the drama that is happening here. The father who's trying to protect himself, but also his sons at the same time, and the sons are also fearful of the serpent and looking to their father for some kind of assistance, of which none of these three get, and they're ultimately devoured by this serpent. So this is a direct connection between Greek theater and sculpture. The almost immediacy of theatrics and drama playing itself out not on a Greek stage, but rather by a Greek sculptor in marble. Now, from history books and from writings from the Greeks, we know that the Greeks actually had quite a bit of paintings. And those paintings were supposed to be beautifully made and rendered almost realistically, much like their sculptures. But because these paintings were made on wood panels and wood doesn't last over time, it deteriorates from moisture and just from rot and termites. Unfortunately, we've lost many, if not all, of those Greek paintings. We do, though, fortunately enough, have two types of artwork that give us some indication of what those Greek paintings would have looked like. One of them, and the more common to the Greeks, would have been these vase paintings. Now, vases were much like plastic bottles and glass bottles for today. They were used from everything from olive oil, water, and wine and perfume. And some of them were elevated to an art form that was much higher in quality, and those were painted exquisitely, as you can see here. The other one were mosaics, and we'll get into the next lecture. But mosaics are basically a scene made primarily during this time in marble, colored marble, but over time, as we move along in art history, these types of mosaics will be made of glass. Now, let's focus on this particular mosaic, and let's bring it back to what we were talking about earlier in this lecture, which was about Greek drama and how it plays out in the visual arts. Now, if you remember from the last lecture when we were talking about the metropolis or the big city, or the big cities that were made after Alexander the Great expanded the Greek Empire, we remember who Alexander the Great was, and this particular mosaic is celebrating his battle between himself, his army, and Darius III of Persia. Now, this is quite large. It takes over one large wall in a museum. There are some pieces missing here. You can see those big kind of large brown sections that are missing, but for the most part, we can really wrap our minds around what this would have looked like. So we have to the far left Alexander the Great, and you can see the wind is kind of blowing back as he's charging forth. This is a great battle, and if we were actually there, or if this was a movie, it actually looks like the dimensions of a movie theater. We would expect all those sounds and screams and clanging of shields and swords that you would hear in a reenactment of a war like this in any Hollywood film. Much like Greek theater, this has a story. There's a narrative. We ask ourselves, who are these characters? What are they doing? And what's going to happen? Well, it's Alexander the Great on the far left, hair blowing back, his horse charging forth. And he is ultimately defeating Darius here. And if you just look at their two faces, you have this extreme confidence in Alexander the Great as he's charging from the left, where he is, to the right. If you look at Darius' face, there's this look of pure fear or disbelief that he's losing the battle. And you can see all of his soldiers are in disarray as they flee, moving to the right of the image. There is this disorganization as they are scattering in defeat, whereas on Alexander the Great's side, there is pure direction and force as they charge onward. Let's look at some of the details here, because this is really where the magic of this work comes alive. First of all the various dimensions. We have horses that are going left and right. We even have one that's going from where we are out into the image. It's actually the rear end of a horse that's almost at the center of this mosaic. And there's almost a three-dimensional aspect to this. If you've ever drawn or painted, you know that's extremely difficult to make things believable and make them look as if they're in three dimensions. Another fascinating part of this is if you look to the bottom right hand, just below the rear end of that horse, what you see is a shield. And in that shield, you actually see the fearful face of a defeated soldier who was part of Darius's army here. And what the artist is doing here is showing us those dramatic moments of this type of scene, but that he's also showing off his ability to create art in this mosaic. Because not only is he depicting the swords and shields and horses here, but he's also depicting light, the reflected light off of the shield, where we see in one case the back of the soldier's head, but also his reflected face on that shield. It is really a magnificent work of art, and it really captures the drama of Alexander the Great, this great victory, and ultimately creates this cinematic experience for us that resonates with us even some 2,000 years later in this modern world. The ultimate goal of theater is to draw the viewers in and to have a theatrical experience, to transport them from their everyday lives into something else. Now, if you walk backstage of any modern theater, you'll see all the tricks behind this magic. The lights, the pulleys that allow the sets to come and go. So that the people in the seats believe in this magical experience and have a more profound feeling about what they're watching. Now, if you walk down the aisles and gangways of a Greek theater down to the orchestra where the actors were and then went beyond, you would encounter something much like a modern theater. You would find props, you'd have actors getting ready for their scenes, but you'd also have things that may be unthinkable in a world that had no electricity. The ability to make people float with these large ropes and pulley systems. Now, you've got to imagine for the people who are coming from these small towns and metropolises, to go to the theater and see this happen must have been something like a spiritual experience, or something extremely magical. Now, one of the works of architecture and sculpture that carries on this dramatic experience is in the altar of Zeus in Pergamon. And what the architects and sculptors did was combine these two mediums, architecture and sculpture, in a way that made the experience all the much more magical. Much like in the theater. If you can see here, it's a series of steps that move up to the top of the altar. And what the architect and sculptor did here was envision people walking up the steps. And as they looked to the left and right of the altar, they would see these large relief sculptures that would also be climbing up the steps. And so that it would seem as if that average Greek citizen walking up the steps was walking up the steps with the gods and goddesses from the Greek mythology. So it really comes alive here. The theater of architecture and sculpture, in other words, is really surrounding the individuals who walk to this altar in a way that is like Greek theater. It takes us somewhere else. It makes these moments more magical. And so if we remember the evolution of the pediment a couple of lectures ago, where we talked about the relationship between architecture and sculpture and how these sculptures fit in these triangular pediment shapes, you can see in this altar of Zeus here how much more dramatic the experience is for the viewers and the visitors to the building. But if we're going to talk about architecture and sculpture as theatrical experiences, there's no better example than this sculpture here. It's referred to as the Nike of Samothrace. Now, Nike is the goddess of victory. And, of course, because of time, we've lost the head and the arms. But what we're left with is this dramatic figure of the female form. You can see that the wings are pushed back as if the wind is blowing and she's about to take flight. And if you look down further onto her garments, you can almost feel the breeze pushing back onto that body. Now, you have to know that this sculpture was placed on a small island near the coast, and thus the sea breeze would be pretty normal on any given day on this small Greek island. So that if you're standing next to this sculpture, your toga, your clothes, would also be blowing in the wind, much like this sculpture of Nike. Now, to take that experience one step further, this sculpture was placed on a monument that's shaped like a ship. And at the base of this ship were small holes that allowed water to be pushed out and sprayed out, so that it looked like this boat was actually cutting through water and water was spraying out. That, in combination with these wind-blown wings and clothes, would have made this a true theatrical experience. The spectator in this case is not sitting in the theater seats, but they're standing right next to this monument, and they're feeling that breeze, and they are taking part in this well orchestrated experience of both architecture and sculpture coming together. Now, to really kind of get a feel of what this would have felt like, you can just walk out of the theater of St. Francis onto the main courtyard, and you'll be confronted with a sculpture and a site that are reminiscent of what Nike of Samothrace would have been like. And this is the fountain and statue of St. Clair. You can see the running water and how it works with this statue of St. Clair. If you've ever found yourself seated there, you can hear the water running and feel the breeze and look at the statue of St. Clair and see her clothes as it kind of brushes back in the wind as she steps out onto that body of water. Myself, being the sculptor and designer of this space, really was inspired by the Nike of Samothrace when I thought and envisioned this space. And so you can see how it's kind of a modern interpretation of this Greek monument of Nike of Samothrace, and that it is, just like that Greek spot, a theatrical experience, somewhere you can go and lose yourself and maybe be transported to some more magical space.